Because you went to the Art Design Center in LA, isn't it?
Art Center College of Design,
Yeah.
right? Yeah. In fact, I've been teaching there recently.
Let's just start with how you got interested in all of this. Okay, ready? Anytime.
Boy, it goes back a lot earlier than that, though. You know, my first interest in cars really came about when I was in grammar school, and the first MG started showing up in the Bay Area. I lived over in Sausalito, California, and a next-door neighbor of mine bought an MG, which I just thought was an incredible automobile. But he was kind of a wild man and decided that he was going to race it, and started tearing the fenders off it and hopping up the engine. So I got to see that entire process. And the small garage that he was working at also had a very good fabricator of the old school, a Frenchman named Nato Bourgeois, down there building specials. And this was in Sausalito, California. So during this whole period of time, I got my first job. I was 11 years old, sweeping out the garage, and had a chance to see all these really wonderful early sports cars of the early 50s, literally. This is about 1948, 49, 50. And went to the first Pebble Beach races in the early 50s, and watched NATO build this car, literally fabricate it, you know, out of sheet aluminum and steel. And it was a great thing to me, because I saw him build this whole car up over several months, and he hardly ever said a word to me, but I was always kind of peeking in, you know, in the door there. He was a real gruff old guy. And I remember one Saturday afternoon, I was down at the shop cleaning up, and looked in the window, and he beckoned to me to come over and pointed to sit down in the seat of the car. And he got in and he fired this car up, and it was an all aluminum blown MG TC Special with the blower screaming on it. And we took off for a test run through the hills of Marin County, and it changed my life. It was really, I think, one of those pivotal moments you have in your life, and I was so young and it affected me so deeply that I really fell in love with cars at that time.
And that would have been about
1951 or 52.
At the ripe old age
yeah.
of 11 or 12, huh?
I think I was 12 years old, yeah. But running this car, you know, flat out through the mountains around there, and there was no traffic in those days, and you know, we were drifting through these corners at, you know, 80 to 120 miles an hour, and he was steering it with the throttle. And it just transcended everything that I'd ever seen or been around, you know, and it just was so different. And I came back and decided that's really what I wanted to do, you know, because it was just beautiful. It was art.
Well, I can tell it's a vivid memory.
Yeah, yeah.
And then you went on to study.
Well, at that point, yeah, I said, okay, this is what I want to do, but I didn't know where to go or what to do or anything on it. And you know, I decided I had to have an MG when I was 16. You know, so I started saving all my money and beating on my mom to, you know, let me get a car like that when I was 16. So it took me, you know, about 4 years to collect enough dollars and enough thing to do it. But I got my MG when I was 16, and started going to all the racing. Yeah, started going to all the races, yeah. So there wasn't a race on the West Coast I didn't go to. And I literally started at Pebble Beach. Obviously, you couldn't drive at that time, but I went down there and I worked flags, I worked communication, hung out with all the guys that were building race cars. And this was a Northern California group that was a little more conservative, sort of the typical SCCA type. But in going down to these races in Pebble Beach, there was a whole bunch of guys that came up from Southern California, and they were sort of the Visigoths, you know. They came up with MGs that had blown MG 60 V8 60s in them, and Cad Allards, and just all of this really wild hot rod stuff. And that was the whole era that Phil Hill was driving at the very, very beginning. And that was another big change in my life, because I saw it wasn't what the factory gave you, but it was what you built. So from what NATO showed me and what the guys down in Southern California showed me, I said, I got to go to Southern California. So I decided one Easter vacation to head down there. And during that time, I'd heard about a school in California that taught automotive design. So I went down and found this school. At that time, it was in Los Angeles. It was called the Art Center College of Design. And I walked in there and I was absolutely blown away by all the work. I hadn't had any artwork at all in my life at all. And I was just getting out of high school. And I went in there and I said, this is, you know, this is really what I want to do. So I went into the office and said, I want to go to school here. And they said, well, that's fine. What's your portfolio? And I mean, to give you an idea how naive I was, I said, what's a portfolio? You know, they said, well, you have to bring, you know, examples of your work. And I said, well, I don't have any work. That's why I want to go to school here, you know. So they, you know, sort of patted me on the head. And of course, all the people that were going there were already professionals that were coming back and, you know, trying to get a job in the industry. So I insisted. I said, look, I really want to go to school here. So they said, well, you'll have to, you know, bring us some examples of your work. And I said, well, what kind of examples? And they said, what do you want to do? I said, I want to draw cars and design cars. So they said, all right, well, go draw cars. So I literally went out in the car with my high school binder, you know, 3-ring binder with the blue lines, and drew pictures of hot rods and brought them back in the door and said, here, is this it? And I had no idea, you know, what you had to have. But I think that they sort of could sense the enthusiasm there. And so that's when I met Strother McMinn, who was my instructor at that time, and has since been a mentor all of my life, and has been responsible for training most of the great automotive designers in the world. So I've known Mac all my life, and I didn't have enough money really to finish school. I got about halfway through, and Mac arranged to have Chuck Jordan, at that time was on his way up in management at GM, come fly out, looked at my portfolio, and then flew me back to GM. I was 19, and they hired me. So I went to work, you know, for Bill Mitchell and Chuck Jordan.
As one of the youngest guys ever to be there.
Well, I was same age as Mac when he started there, and he realized that I could do it. So I started working there, and I went back there primarily because I was interested both in the engineering of automobiles and the aesthetic design of automobiles. So I began working in what they call the research division of styling. Before you go in and work in a main studio, they try you out in some of the special advanced studios. So at that time, I was fortunate enough to be there in the era. It was October of '57, and Bill Mitchell was thinking about designing a new Corvette, and he was the guy that was really responsible for all of the major high-performance stuff that was happening at GM. Harley Earl at that time was phasing out, and Mitchell was taking over. And Mitchell was a great enthusiast, loved race cars, and decided that we were going to do a new Corvette. And GM had just decided that they were going to get out of racing. Zora Duntov had built the SS Corvette for Sebring that March, and then the edict came down that there was going to be no more racing. Well, there are actually 2 SS Corvettes. There was the Mule, that was the car that they'd done all the testing on, and then the SS. Mitchell was able to buy the Mule for $1 from GM, and then we designed the first Sting Ray prototype on that particular car. And a fellow named Chuck Pellman and myself laid out the lines for that car, and that eventually moved into another studio. Larry Shinoda came in and finished the car up with Mitchell, and that became the prototype for the Sting Ray, which is developed into the production car in 1963. So that was the origin.
63 split window coupe.
Right, yeah. So the car was originally designed by myself and Chuck Pellman under Mitchell in the research division of styling as a coupe. Mitchell came in, put the split window on it. The split window's origin came from the '57 Bugatti Atlantique, which was a great favorite of Mitchell's, and he always loved that back end on the car, and he wanted that flavor in the automobile, so that went into the car. But it was such a complicated and expensive thing, and the vision was out of it so poor that they changed it again in '64. So it was only in that 1 year. But Larry did pretty much all of the production car. But the early car I did with Chuck, and that was the car that was raced by Dr. Dick Thompson around most of the East Coast, and probably one of the prettiest cars ever done at GM. I think Bill Mitchell, I think of all the cars that he was responsible for doing at GM, I think that was his favorite car, and really one of the best, I think, that ever came out of GM. And it's hard to believe it came out in 57 and 58, because if you realize that era, what the cars were looking like coming out of GM, that was the last of the behemoths, the great chrome behemoths that were responsible for being done by Harley Earl. And he kind of got off his direction there. But Bill was pretty much on direction, what he wanted to do with the cleanliness. You know, evidently he knew where he wanted to go, and eventually he did great cars like the Riviera and some of the great cars through the 60s. So Bill was another great influence on things that I had a chance to work on for GM. But with no racing at GM, I had bought my first race car at that time. It was an old Cooper team car from Le Mans that had raced for the factory. And I bought it as a basket case and restored it over the winter, and decided I want to go back out to California and get on with my career of being a race driver. So I packed all my worldly goods, which was pretty much my race car, in my Volkswagen van and headed for California. And I ended up working out of Max Balchowski's shop out there, sort of exchange for space for working on my race car. I chased parts for him during the day and work on my own cars at night, and helped him do whatever he had to build the old Yellers. So I got to know Max, and he again was one of the great influences in my life, with NATO and McMinn, and certainly Max Balchowski, because Mac is the guy that really taught me that there's nothing sacred in any kind of engineering or automotive. If it works, and it doesn't matter what everybody else says about what should work. You test it for yourself. And he was able to build great cars out of American components. I mean, that was one of the great high points of American hot rodding, that he was able to take production components literally out of the junkyard and build a special that was at least equal or better to most of the European Ferraris and Maseratis of that time. Everything he did was sort of to poke fun at all the seriousness of other life, and that was the thing that was important. So,
okay,
we're back on it?
Yep.
All right, so let's get back where we were.
Well, I was just going to say that that was
Okay.
one of Max's claims to fame, was that he could make something out of nothing almost.
Well, he had a very selective eye. He knew what he wanted to do with design in terms of automotive design. He looked at things very analytically. He'd been a watchmaker's apprentice. He was a very talented fabricator. Not very clean in the way he did things, but certainly serviceable. And if he could get the job done with a junkyard part, that's the way he didn't do it. I mean, he didn't spend a lot of time making some really exotic part. If he could find, say, an upper A-arm off a Morris Minor 1000, he'd use that instead of making a tube frame part. You know
I guess
what I mean?
it wasn't always pretty, but it won.
It worked. I mean, he was the guy that figured out how to make it work. And as I said, he had a great sense of humor. He took great pleasure in going out and sort of puncturing the balloon of all of these people that showed up with giant 40-foot trailers and mechanics and Maseratis as deep as you could see, and he'd pull up alongside, and he drove the car to the races all the time. He drove the car to the races, and that's what really created the reliability for his automobiles. Is he drove many places. He never took a trailer. The cars were always driven on the street, and he'd drive in, and I mean, what he brought with him, a little bunch of tools. That was it. That's what he raced with. He'd take the mufflers off the side and fire up the car and go out and run it, and usually win. And it just, drove people absolutely wild, because he had a great following, because people began to appreciate what he did. But, I mean, he'd make a great show. For example, the guys in the Maserati would be changing oil before the race, and they'd be ready to go dump all the oil in the trash can. He'd go, wait, stop, let me have that oil, So he'd take the used oil out of their Maserati and he'd put it in the Buick, Or he'd go and he'd take all the roll spark plugs out of the trash can and run them in the car, And he just did stuff like that because it just got to everybody.
Drove them nuts.
And just drove them nuts. He'd win with their throwaway stuff. And he's still that way, and one of my great friends and one of the great influences in my life. And having a chance to work with all of these great guys, I mean, eventually working with Shelby is the same sort of thing. It's just an opportunity to work with some of the greatest people in the world in Southern California who collected there after the war. The great fabricator from Shelby American, Phil Remington, who was the leader of probably half a dozen to 10 of the greatest fabricators in the world that worked for Shelby, and see all of this work. It was a continuation of all of that stuff that I'd learned as a kid working with NATO, and coming down there and seeing guys that were just on another plane above that who could fabricate and build anything. It was just an incredible experience. So all of my life, I've sort of revered these guys that can build stuff. It's not just that you can draw it, but that you can build it. And the great builders are the guys that are my heroes. So in trying to recapture some of that history of the 64, 65 racing season, which I did in this book on Shelby, it's pretty much about the people that made the difference. It wasn't the cars or the races or the drivers. It's the way all of this stuff came about, you know, the humanness of how these things were done and what these guys had to do to build it, you know.
And that book is about Shelby, but centers around the Daytona Coupe.
Well,
yes?
it started out as a book about the Daytonas, but as I got writing it and I went back and interviewed all the guys that I'd worked with on the car, I realized that the cars are only the structure. You know, it was their story of what they did to build the cars that made it so fascinating. And these guys were, you know, I mean, I was again just a kid. I was like 22 years old by the time I was working there, and here I was working with all of these guys that were my heroes. That, you know, I've been listening to the Indianapolis races since I was 12 years old, and these guys that all worked for Watson and Kuzma and Frank Curtis. You know, I mean, these were legends that, you know, I had a chance here. I was working with them all, and watching them work and build things was, to me, just absolutely incredible. So I had sort of developed my own philosophy of design and what I wanted to do with automotive stuff. So when I came to them with my ideas and they put them all down, I was absolutely devastated, you know, because they didn't think much of my idea for the coupe at all. But they hadn't ever raced in Europe, with the exception of Phil. He'd worked with Lance Reventlow in Europe, but he didn't think much of going to Europe anyway with Shelby. He thought it was just kind of a pipe dream and that we'd never do it, so he wasn't too impressed with the ideas I had. So
it was pretty bold on your part to take on the design of the coupe at all. I mean,
well,
you're not really an aerodynamics guy.
It was a project, again, that when I'd first met Shelby, he was driving the old Yeller for Max, and I was working for Max, and Shelby used to come over, and we'd talk about what we were going to do. And actually, my second job when I left Max's place was to go to work for Carroll as an instructor for his driving school. So we'd had an idea about where we wanted to go and what we wanted to do with the car, and certainly Carroll had great plans, but he hadn't figured out how it was all going to happen. And it's all pretty well known, the history of how he got together with AC and Ford. But what most people don't understand is that when Ford came in to help us out on that project, this wasn't a major program. I mean, this was a throwaway for Ford Motor Company. The main effort that Ford was doing at that time was stock car racing. Most of their money was being spent in the Southeast with Holman Moody. They believed in win on Sunday, sell on Monday. And most of their engineering staff believed in that as well. And the whole idea of building cars and going and racing them in Europe did not go over very well with Ford management, because they were isolationists, let's call them, you know, very, very conservative. They didn't believe in what was going to be going on in Europe. And it was really Henry Ford II who had the vision to realize that Ford was going to expand, be a worldwide company. Of course, his father had set up, you know, Ford over in Europe. There was, you know, Ford in Germany and England, but they were very small divisions. Henry Ford II began to see what he wanted to do in making Ford an international company. And this was the first use of possibly taking racing on an international basis. So he had a lot of resistance within Ford Motor Company at that time for a road racing program. But we had two guys that came out from Ford Motor Company, Ray Geddes and Peyton Kramer, who were responsible for seeing where the dollars were going to go with Shelby, and literally trying to figure out how to get the money out of Ford Motor Company for us, who became really the backing and the reason that we got what we wanted. If it hadn't have been for Ray Geddes, the whole program would never have ever happened. And he was able to, you know, find money within programs at Ford to give to Shelby to do the things that we wanted to do. And as far as Ford's concerned at that time, they didn't really have any interest in going to Europe. Carroll wanted to do that, but if he'd gone to Ford and said, I want to build cars and go back and race against Ferrari, they would have said, forget it. You know, all they were interested in doing was figuring out a way to embarrass Chevrolet. And here was a real good, cheap way to do it. So the whole program at the beginning was simply to go racing against Chevrolet, and the growing professionalism in SCCA racing, which in the first year, '63, became the US RRC Championship, the United States Road Racing Championship. And we hit the ground running literally in the first year, just demolished Chevrolet. And Chevrolet started to come back with Zora Duntoff's Grand Sport. And they had us down on the mat pinned. We were out cold at Nassau. They had the best car, and GM management blew the deal, canceled the program, and didn't give us any competition, and we continued on to win. And they blew it. They had us down with the 390 Grand Sport Corvette. They could have blown our doors off with one arm behind their back. And GM was still stuck with their 57 AMA ban on racing, and they said, we're going to continue on with this. We're not going to get involved back in performance. At least blatantly, publicly, they weren't. They were still doing a lot. They had a great racing engineering department, but they decided not to do it. It was a great disappointment for Zora Duntoff, I think the greatest in his life, because he had a chance to come back, blow Shelby off, who'd made a great name for Ford, and they dropped the ball. And at that point, since we'd won the USRC Championship, we turned those cars over to our private drivers and decided to go to Europe. And it really started out because the first two FIA races were at Daytona and Sebring. We got just enough money. Ray Geddes enabled us to get that money to run those races. And we led at Daytona with the Daytona Coupe. We were DNF'd because of a fire in the pits, and then we came back at Sebring and we won the event, going away from the Ferraris. So at that point, we had proved we could be faster than the Ferraris, and then at Sebring we won, and it put us ahead in the points, and they made the decision to back us, and we went to Europe. And we went over there with literally a 2-car team and 8 guys. I mean, it was just as minimal as you can imagine, and we came that close from winning that championship. If it hadn't have been for some political machinations with Ferrari canceling the last race of the season at Monza, Italy, we would have won the championship. And he, in '65, realized that the Daytona Coupe was going to blow away the Ferraris, so he put all of his effort into prototype racing, and the GT racing became something that he turned over to his private organizing teams. And Shelby's Daytona Coupes were given to the Alan Mann Group, which was a private English team backed by the English Ford Group. And they were the ones that actually won the championship for Shelby in 1965. And all of Shelby's effort was then diverted to the GT40s, because prior to that point, they'd been run by Holman Moody and Carcraft, and not very successfully, and Ford wanted to win with those automobiles. So that program was shifted to Shelby American for the first part of 1965. And again, with the crew of people we had working there, led by Phil Remington, they made those cars winners, and from that point on, there wasn't any stopping. So we escalated very, very quickly. I mean, we went from a club racer to international racing in one season, and for that reason, we had all the top American guys driving for us. Phil Hill was driving for us, Dan Gurney was driving for us, Bob Bondurant was driving for us, and we brought along some other, really good American drivers like Ed Leslie and Alan Grant, guys who could really get out and do the job. So it was just this incredible escalation of competition that was going on. And having lived through that with all these guys that I idolized, that were my heroes, was a pretty strong period in my life, you know.
The Daytona Coupe is probably the car you're best known for as the complete car, but you've done some stunning cars other than that.
They've certainly been aesthetic successes, if not actual competition successes, because like many racing programs, if the development money isn't there, the timing isn't right, you know, it doesn't get seen. But certainly the Daytona was a beautiful car and has certainly been, I think, recognized now as a, you know, a fairly milepost design in race car design. But there were several cars, again, that I had working with friends of mine, like Trevor Harris. We did a car for the Japanese at the Toyota factory called the JP6, which I think is one of the prettiest cars I've ever done, and nobody's ever seen it. And had some real advanced thinking. Trevor had some suspension design on that car that was, at the time, so advanced that it was just, it was beyond anybody else's thinking. I mean, he's really a brilliant guy on the geometry of the suspension of that car.
Well, another one of your Japanese endeavors was the Hino Samurai.
Yes, the first company I worked for after leaving Shelby, and I left Shelby because at that point Ford Motor Company was taking over, and they didn't really have any use for a 22-year-old designer. They had an entire design department and everything they needed. So they pretty much moved in and took over, and I moved out and set up my own racing shop. And the first people I went to work for were the Japanese, a little company called Hino, who is primarily a manufacturer of trucks and buses. They're the largest manufacturer of trucks and buses in the Orient, and build very, very high quality stuff. They're like the Mercedes-Benz of the Orient. And at that time, they had a small division automotive-wise, and were interested in coming into the American market. None of the other Japanese companies had yet entered the American market. They were all sort of landing on the shores, and they all came into the American market, surprisingly enough, with pickup trucks. The first sedans they brought in didn't work at all, but Nissan had pickup trucks and Toyota had pickup trucks, and Hino, being a manufacturer of commercial vehicles, also had pickup trucks. And so they were trying to get into the market, and they had a beautiful little coupe that had been designed by Michelotti, 1300cc, called a Contessa. And again, you have to go back in history. There was no sedan racing in the United States at this time, but the Cal Club division of the SCCA at that time had started some sedan racing in California. So there was a bunch of wild-eyed guys out there running around in Volvos and Mini Coopers and Ford Cortinas and, you know, all this kind of crazy stuff that you never got to see any place in the United States. But there was enough cars out there to make a field. And so we brought these Hinos in and gave them the full California treatment, and they were fast. So as it turned out, where it really took off for me is that we had a race called the Mission Bell Cup that preceded what eventually became the Can-Am race at Riverside. At that time, it was the Times Mirror Grand Prix. It had not yet become the Can-Am Series. So they had this Mission Bell Cup, and because they didn't want to bring out and run all the rest of the SCCA classes, they decided just to run sedans because they couldn't run all the other races before the Times Mirror, so they decided to run sedans. So we had this big sedan race out there, and we ended up winning first and second with these two Hinos that I'd built in my shop. And the Japanese were just coming into the market, so when I pulled into Victory Lane with the thing, I was surrounded by Japanese photographers and engineers and everything who had come to see what racing was like in the United States. They'd actually come to see the Times Mirror Grand Prix. And in Japan, the Hino factory was sort of at the bottom of the pecking order in racing. I mean, they were unknown over there. And Toyota and Nissan were the two big companies. And they came over to the United States, and here Hino's #1 in the United States. So the next day in Japan, you know, the headlines were Hino wins, you know, Riverside Grand Prix. And so we got a lot of publicity out of that. It went a long way to establish my name in Japan. And from that, I began doing more contract work in Japan. So we're back going again?
Yep.
Okay, so
Well,
let's go back.
that's where the Samurai came from.
So the Samurai, it was interesting. When I began working for the Hino company, I was asked to go over there and consult with them on what they should do about entering the American market. And the man that I worked over there, Mr. Miyako, who was the controller of the company, was the only guy that really spoke English in the company. But the president was an enthusiast, and his board of directors was, unlike most Japanese companies, which are run on a consensus basis by a board of directors. Hino was run by the director, the main director of the company, the chairman of the board, and his board of directors pretty much did whatever he wanted. It was very much like Honda. Honda was run by an individual. All other Japanese companies are run by a board. So Mr. Miyako explained that if I laid out a fairly conservative program, they'd be willing to go with me. So I thought I died to gone to heaven. They'd given me the racing program. They were going to give me the project to design all their new cars. And I was going to be the distributor for their automobiles in the United States, as well as the trucks and buses when they came in. So I had everything in life that I wanted at that time. And about a week before we signed the final contracts and all the money came in, he died. So the whole thing went down the tube. And Toyota ended up trying to take over the company. And through Toyota, I ended up starting to do some work for Toyota. But Shelby, this is 1965, had just lost his contract with Ford, and he was looking around for something to do, so he bought a Toyota dealership. So when he's signing the papers, he said, "Have you ever thought about going racing?" You know, and they said, "Well, yes, we've just signed Peter Brock to run our racing program." And he says, "Well, hell, he's just the guy that changes tires for me." And of course, they knew who Shelby was. So as it turned around, Shelby ended up shooting me down on the program, went over there. They signed with Shelby and wouldn't admit to me that they had done it, and gave the program to develop their 2000 sports car to Shelby. And I kept thinking they were going to send me the stuff, and they didn't do it. So finally I found out what was going on. So I went to Nissan and said, "You've got to give me some cars to go racing." And they refused to do it. They said, "Our 2000 sports car isn't good enough to compete with the new 2000 Yamaha designed sports car from Toyota, so we're not interested." So it turned out I went back to Mr. Miyako, the controller at Hino, my great friend. He had gone to school with the president of Nissan Motor Corporation. He went to him, told him what I wanted to do, and from the factory in Japan, they sent me the cars and the money to build them, and we ended up winning the Pacific Coast Division Championship the first year with the Toyota 2000. So we went with a car they didn't even think was competitive and had not been competitive. We ended up winning the championship against, you know, all the factory triumphs and everything that we're running. And then the next year we got the 240Zs, and we went into what was really the golden age of club racing, because we had, on the East Coast, we had Porsche teams with Al Holbert. On the Pacific Coast, we had a team with Richie Ginther. And we also had a Midwest team out of Kansas City. So there were 3 factory Porsche teams. Bob Tullius's Group 44 out of the East Coast, Kaz Kasner's racing team out of the West Coast, Carroll Shelby's 2000 team, and my team, BRE, and on the East Coast, Bob Sharp's team. So we had all of these factories racing, more money going into club racing than any other type of racing at that time. And we won the national championships in 70 and 71 with the 240Zs. And then in 71, we started running the 2.5 Datsun 510s. And we also won against BMW and Alfa teams as well. So we had a lot of great racing, you know.
And then what did BRE do after that?
We pretty much got legislated out of the SCCA because we were so successful. BMW quit, Alfa quit, so there was nobody to race. Ford and GM had already died out on the Trans Am, so the Trans Am pretty much just died a natural death, and there was nothing else to do. And I discovered hang gliding, and I closed my shop down and went hang gliding. And for the next 7 years, I built hang gliders and competed all over the world. We won 6 out of the 7 years the World Championship for cross-country hang gliding. And most people weren't even aware of what was going on at that time, but hang gliding was a very, very wonderful and intense sport that I got involved in. And I mean, when I started on it, we were, flying off of sand dunes, and if we could make it 50 yards, that was a big deal. And toward the end, we were flying well over 150 miles. We were flying at altitudes of 20,000 feet. So we reinvented the airplane during that whole period. And it was probably one of the most exciting areas of my entire life, even more so than motor racing in some ways. Hang gliding was really that whole era of the development of the flex wing self-launch sailplane. We reinvented a type of aircraft that had never been possible. Nobody had ever self-launched airplanes that would climb in thermals and would go great distances. And the crew I put together to do that pretty much changed aviation, and a lot of the stuff that we developed is still being used today. Every modern hang glider today came out of the stuff that we developed at the company that I had called UP, Ultralight Products.
And that led to kind of another grand vision of yours, which was the Eve Star.
Well, we wanted to know what we were going to do with all this technology. We thought we would build an ultralight aircraft for the third world, primarily to do crop dusting. Because there's a great shortage of food in the world, and we could see that with a very inexpensive crop duster, we could change the way people grew food around the world. So the whole thing stopping the program was to build a super lightweight engine. And I got together with a guy that's really a brilliant engineer up in the Seattle area, a guy named Alex Pong, who designed this engine, but I wasn't able to come up with quite enough money to finish the thing up. So we were never able to complete it. We actually built 2 flying prototypes using Rotax 2-stroke engines, which is the current state of the art. And they're still probably the hottest ultralights ever built. I mean, they've got 1,500 foot per minute climb rate. They're fully aerobatic, fabulous airplanes. But with no engine that's really, really reliable, it isn't something that you could put into a commercial basis. It's a great fun airplane, a hobbyist airplane, but if you're going to do something commercially, you've got to be able to, get that thing and go out and turn it on and fly hours and hours and hours with complete reliability in areas of the world that don't have any ability to work on mechanical objects. So it never came to pass. Still there, the opportunity's still there,
And what are you doing now?
I'm spending a lot of time writing. I spent the last couple of years writing this book on my adventures with Shelby in '64, '65. Which
you have a copy of that?
Yeah,
yeah. Show me the cover of that.
So this is the book. It's about 550 pages, over 600 photographs, and it tells the real true story of what we did at Shelby American with this incredible group of guys, about 8 or 10 guys building these cars. And we went to Europe with an aerodynamic coupe, and the bottom line is that we blew the Ferraris away. And
so like you say, it's a book that started out to be about the Daytona Coupe, but
right,
it's really about
the people. Because the people are the whole essence of what Shelby American really was. Carroll had an ability to extract the best out of people and also to pick the best people. And he had a group of guys together there that I've never seen anything like it, You could call them all up today and say, hey, Carroll says we're going racing, and they'd all drop what they're doing probably and get back into it. At least Carroll Smith told me to do that, and I think he's one of the great, race car team managers out there. And he said the best group that he'd ever worked for, ever, was Shelby. Because the one thing that Shelby did was he left you alone. If he knew you could do something, he wasn't going to be there to tell you how to do it. He'd change direction in midstream without telling you and say, we're not doing that anymore after you just about got it all done, and saying we're doing something else. But that's because he could see a different picture politically the way it was shaping up. But he wasn't there to try to tell you how to do it mechanically or what was supposed to be done. He felt that if you could do the job and you got it done, it would happen. And that was probably the best thing working for Shell.
That's probably something that'll never be recreated.
I don't think so, not in today's, the closest thing that's going on today is probably the Viper operation. And I've had a chance to be associated with that and watch what's going on closely, and there are a lot of parallels there. There's no one individual as strong as Shelby was at the forefront of that thing, but I think with the people at the top like Lutz, Tom Gale, certainly at Chrysler, and Francois Castang, their philosophy of what they want that car to be very much parallels a lot of the things that Carroll wanted to do at that time. So that program is very, very successful, I think, in their first year, and I think is going to be even more so in 1997.
Well, Pete, I'm going to wish you the greatest success with your book, and I don't think that's necessary. It'll be tough keeping it in print, and I thank you so much for joining us and sharing your experiences.
All right. Well, thank you. Great.
Let me just jump in with a couple of real quick questions.
Okay.
You want me to take the book so it fits back in?
Yeah. Yeah, so it goes back with the, fits in, yeah.
Okay. Yeah, just tell us what you like it first.
You know, my background, of course, was art. I'd worked at GM Styling, but with an art and graphics background at Shelby, I was pretty much responsible for all of the image of the company that when we started out. And those were things that weren't too interesting to Carroll. I mean, he didn't really care one way or another what it looked like, and it meant a lot to me. And again, if he was happy with what's happening, he'd let you do anything you wanted. So it was important to me with, you know, what the emblems looked like and what the lettering was like and what the ads were like. So I had a chance to do everything. We didn't have a big budget, so I had to do everything. So I ended up shooting the pictures, writing the copy, doing the paste ups, you know, placing the ads myself. It was an in-house deal. And when it finally, you know, developed up to the point where he said, you know, I think we're going to go to Europe. Can you design a car? Well, I had all the background there to do it. And I said, of course, I know exactly what I wanted to do. So I sketched up what I wanted to do. And it was based pretty much on a lot of studies that I'd read about that the Germans had done in the late 30s. And when I had worked at GM, I had spent my lunch hours in their library, and they have a fabulous library at GM Styling. And I had found some early studies by a guy named Koenig Fashionfeld who had done some aerodynamic studies on automobiles. And they were really strange looking automobiles with flat roofs and chopped off tails. And so I went around to everybody at GM and I said, look at this stuff. This is really incredible. Look at these numbers. And it's all in German. And, you know, nobody could read German, but I said, look at the numbers here, the little graphs, and everything was all perfectly laid out. And they go, that stuff was done in 1939. That's all weird looking stuff. And I'm going, no, this is really important. And the fact that I couldn't get anybody to listen to me on it because they were interested in the cars looking like jet planes and chrome and three colors, you know. So I just realized I was, you know, really, I loved what I was doing there with GM. There was a great bunch of guys, but they weren't looking at automotive design as function. And that's really what I wanted to do. So I realized that if I was going to combine what I wanted to do in automotive design, I was going to have to go do it someplace else. And so I went back to California, wanted to combine that with my racing, and Shelby gave me the opportunity to do that. So when I came up with the idea and I sat down with Carroll and explained the whole thing to him, he really believed in it and said, okay, you know, we're going to do it. And then as I explained earlier, when I went down and I showed all this stuff to my heroes in the fabrication department, it was the same response that I got from GM. They looked at that stuff, they said, man, that stuff they done in 1939, there's no value in anything there. And I said, it's all as good today. When they lost the war, I said, the only reason that we're not marching around in, you know, German army helmets is because we won the war, but otherwise all the cars that look like that. And they were only interested in open wheel racing and going to Indy. So I made this presentation to Carroll. He said, we'll build the car that way. So when I presented the car sort of to the shop, there was major, major negativity toward the car. And if it hadn't have been for Ken Miles coming along, who had also had some sense of history and knew what the Germans had done and believed in the idea, probably we wouldn't have gotten it done. And then with John Olson, who was a young New Zealander who had come to work for us during that period of time, we were the three outsiders that got the car project started. And when we went out and tested it at Riverside and it was 3 seconds a lap faster than anything we'd ever run out there, then everybody began to see the value of it, and they jumped in, and everybody began to put their own effort into it, and it became a success.
Well, the story goes that you were only given about $2,000 to...
I don't think we even had that much, literally. I mean, it was really a bottom of the barrel program. I mean, first of all, there was no money from Ford to do it. What money that Ray did scrape together for us, we put into making the thing happen. And it was all an experiment, to see if it would happen. And if it hadn't have been for Ray trying to scrape that bit of money for us, we never would have gotten it together. But just increment by increment, we did it. And again, these guys at Shelby all dived in and made it work, and the car was very, very fast, and it literally changed the way cars were designed. But it was the last of the cars that were built by mechanics and fabricators. From there on, the next major stage was the GT40, which was a fully engineered car designed by Eric Broadley and the people at Ford Motor Company. So we went from tube frame, very simple cars to very complex aerospace type cars. And racing literally changed. It was a transitional period at that time.
Well, Ford didn't really want their GT40s being beat by a Daytona Coupe anyway.
No, they didn't. Their main goal, of course, was to build a GT40, and most people are not aware that when the program first started, Henry Ford had no intention of building his own race cars. What he wanted to do is he wanted to buy a European company, put the Ford name on it, and they figured that'd be the easiest way to go racing. So he went over and he attempted to buy Ferrari, and they came very, very close to buying Ferrari. And at the last minute, Fiat bought Ferrari after Ferrari had agreed to sell to Ford. And Iacocca was at that time in the head of the negotiations. And because he had been rebuffed by Ferrari, he said, well, if Ferrari's not going to sell us the car, then we'll build our own car and defeat Ferrari. So they looked around at the best design going on at that time, and that was being done by Eric Broadley at Lola. So they contracted with Broadley to design a car. Broadley only lasted about 3 months, couldn't stand working with Ford. He said, I'm out of here. So the program shifted over and was finished at Ford Motor Company. And because of the inertia of working with a large corporation, it didn't move as quickly as it should have. So we were literally the second string team that was brought in to fill the gap until the GT40s were ready to run. And they kept dragging on. The programs didn't go very well. And to give you an idea, comparison-wise, at the April trials at Le Mans in 1964 was the first time that we had to run the Daytona Coupe in Europe, and it was also the first time that the first two GT40s were ever run in public. And they had been finished several weeks earlier in England, and they brought two GT40s to Le Mans and the Daytona Coupe, and both the GT40s were destroyed in aerodynamic instability, and the Daytona Coupe was the fastest GT car there at the time, almost the fastest overall from the prototypes. So it was pretty exciting for me because the car that we put together literally, with barely enough money to do it against a program that had been done with no budget limitations at all, we smoked them at Le Mans. And at that point, Ford could see that, we were going to be able to take over for a while until they got the car developed. But for every dollar that was spent on the Daytona, there was probably 10,000 spent on the GT40s. I mean, it was a $40 million program for the GT40s and a minimal budget for the Cobras, but the Cobras are the ones that ended up getting the job done.
The winner built on a shoestring.
Right, exactly. And it was the people. It was the people that Shelby had collected that did it. That was the thing that was the important thing. And it was that collection of people that eventually made Ford Motor Company successful, because the way that they had been running the program up to that time was not successful. And at the end of '64, they said, well, we're not going to try to compete with that. We're just going to shove the Cobra program aside. We're going to put the GT40 program in there. And they did. And I pretty much got moved aside with the Cobra program because I wasn't with this big project that had already been there. So they moved that in there. But all of our fabricators, of course, and mechanics were responsible for doing it. Phil Remington, Carroll Smith, and that team came in there, and they literally reorganized the way those cars were engineered. They enabled them to change the brake rotors and calipers in a matter of seconds, which is the most important thing for a pit stop with the GT40s because they were so fast and so big they had to change the complete brake system. And engineered those types of practical changes that made the cars competitive for the 24-hour race. And with that, they began finally to steamroller Ferrari in the prototype class.
And at that point, the Daytona Coupe just faded into the background.
It faded into the background because all of the international spotlight at that point was focusing on the prototype class and the war between Ferrari and Ford Motor Company. So Geddes still saw the value of racing in the Gran Turismo class and got enough money for us to continue because they ran the prototypes and the Gran Turismos concurrently. So we continued to run the Daytonas, but Shelby did not run the cars. They were run by the Alan Mann organization in England, who had run Ford's racing operations in Europe. They had been running Ford Falcons and Galaxies in sedan racing and the Monte Carlo Rally, and they were familiar with running American V8s, a very, very capable team. So the Daytonas were turned over to the English to run in 1965, and Shelby American concentrated strictly on the GT40s, with the exception of one race, and that was Le Mans in 1965. And that was supposed to be the big win for Ford Motor Company. And at that time, there was a decree that all the motors were going to be built at Ford Motor Company. And as a result of that, they took 12 cars there and they all blew up. So the next year they went back the way Shelby had been doing it, and with all the mechanics that were responsible for building their own engines. And then they became real successful. So Shelby's organization really, and the way he ran it, was the key to the success. Not how much money you had, but the people that did it. And that was the thing that enabled Ford Motor Company to shine against Ferrari.
Can you talk a little bit in the time we have remaining about, was it Super Coupe was the last thing you worked on before you left? Was that?
Yeah, again...
First of all, let me get this. You got a little thing here that I want to get out of
Okay,
there.
great.
How you actually got to leave the company, because your mental picture had changed too about this wasn't the
speed again.
Okay.
Again, you got to realize what's going on at Ford is that, and Shelby's, is that these programs are changing very, very quickly. And Ford, at the time that I started designing the successor to the Daytona Coupe, which was called the Type 65, 65 meaning for the year 1965, I wanted to go back and win Le Mans in a big way, and I knew what it would take to do it. Shelby did not yet have the GT40 program, and he had planned on building a new car, a new Cobra. At that time we called it the Cobra II. And it had been promised from Ford Motor Company that we would have a new engine based on the 427, but it was going to be an aluminum block, a 390 aluminum block. So we laid out a car that we felt we could go 220 miles an hour with. The GT40s were not yet really a viable automobile with Ford Motor Company. And we were competing against Ford, even though Ford was paying the bills on both sides. There were two programs that were competing. And so I designed this coupe that I thought I could win with. As I got the car almost complete and ready to build, Carroll signed the project for the GT40 program, and all the emphasis shifted over to that. We'd already allocated the money for the Type 65, or what became known as the Super Coupe, and it was supposed to be built in Italy. And as it turned out, one of our bean counters was sent over to England to see what the expenses were so high on the GT40, and made a deal to have the car built in England, which is the wrong place to have it done, because I had expected to build it in Italy the way we'd built the Daytonas. So the car was started there. My hands were tied. I couldn't do anything with it. These guys did not do a very good job of building the car. They were months behind schedule. And by that time, the GT40 program had taken over from everything that we'd done. So there was nobody at Shelby that had any interest in the car. And finally, it was it was so late that we just brought it back to the United States, pushed it in the back of the shop, and it was never finished. So when Shelby American closed, it was sold off at auction and was later bought by a group of people that restored the car, a group named Sutherland, two brothers that are quite prominent in the restoration of vintage racing automobiles. And they restored it partially, and then it was taken over by George Stauffer and finished up properly, and now the car is quite fast, but it was never completed.
Well, you had to go to England to kind of oversee or supervise the latter stages of that.
Well, what's happened, it was kind of a boondoggle because the company that was doing the work on the car, they were actually responsible for the GT40 interiors, and they were being paid a lot of money to do these interior contracts. And there was a point there where they were just about to lose the contract because they were so expensive. And they agreed with the bean counter to do this Type 65 car for nothing, they said, if they could keep their interiors project. So the bean counter looked at the dollars and figured, oh, this is a great way to get the car built, not having any understanding of the engineering required, the fabrication required, that they didn't have the facilities to do it. Just wasn't experienced enough to make the decision. He made the right decision from the standpoint of saving money for Ford, but the wrong decision on building the car. So they kept wiring back, oh yes, we're coming along great with the car, and in fact, there was no work being done on the car at all. So I was sent over there to oversee what was happening, and I could see it was a total disaster. And I said, okay, we're gonna get a new chassis, take it down to Italy, get it done in time, and we just ran out of time.
And by the time you got back to Shelby, Ford had largely moved in.
I came back, I stayed over there for 3 months trying to get the car built. When I came back, it was Ford Motor Company at Shelby American. I mean, I went to my office, it had already been taken over, and people said, can we help you? And I said, this is my office, you know. They said, sorry, you're out of here. So at that point, I could see that there was no more, you know, future for myself at Shelby American. And I went off on my own and started my own racing division.
Started BRE.
Right. So it was a wild time.
Pete, is this your first time at the Indiana Shelby Spring Fling?
This is certainly my first time with the Indiana group, and I found it probably one of the most beautiful events. Certainly the setting here in the state park, you know, with all these trees and a really wonderful group of people. I'm always so touched, you know, by how much these people care about these automobiles. I mean, they're just a bunch of old cars, you know, and yet they care about these cars probably more than we did when we were first building them, and probably know more about the real history of the cars, especially the Shelbys, because I was only peripherally involved in the development of the Mustang Shelby. I designed all the exterior components on 65, 66, and then from there on Ford Motor Company came in, and I left by that time, and it became a much larger organization. But it's a great group of people out here, and the events that they put on are just wonderful. And my introduction this morning was that I had to go and get a 289 and bring it to the meet, and to go into a garage and start up a 289 and drive here this morning was an absolute wonder. To drive through these beautiful rolling green roads with this 289 was a lovely experience, and the whole day has been that way. The cars have been that way, and the people. You know, I'm always impressed by the level of finish. You know, it's far beyond anything we ever did at Shelby American. You know, so it's great.
Well, I'm sure the Indiana chapter is honored to have you here, and we are honored to have the chance to talk with you.
Well, great. I really enjoyed it. You know.